Let's turn to Somalia now. The country has been torn apart by more than 3 decades of conflict. But now the country is facing a different kind of challenge. Somalia is the easternmost country in continental Africa, and it's been hit hard by climate change. After its worst drought in 40 years, it then suffered torrential rain and floods. Our climate editor, Justin Rolat, has travelled to Somalia for this special report on how climate change can fuel existing conflicts.
I'm in Somalia, one of the most dangerous countries in the world, to report on how climate change is making conflicts in places like this even worse. But we've got to stay safe, and that means bringing some serious security. Out in the dry scrub that covers much of the country, the climate challenge is clear. Climate change is disrupting the patterns of rain that have kept waterholes like this full. Somalia recently experienced its worst drought for 40 years, an event scientists estimate was made 100 times more likely by human-caused climate change. It has left farmers and herders fighting for access to water and to pasture.
There is no respect if you don't have a gun. The herders who lead their animals into the farm stay back when they see my weapon. They get scared of you.
For the last 30 years, Somalia has been experiencing a brutal Islamist insurgency, a civil war, and a whole series of regional and clan conflicts. It means these local disputes easily spiral into full-blown battles. And Somalia doesn't just face drought. We have come way down to the south of Somalia. This place, Kismayo, is a port town. It has been bitterly fought over. At one stage, Islamist militants from the lethal Al-Qaeda affiliate Al-Shabaab overran the place. Al-Shabaab forces still surround the town. The front line is just 60 kilometers away. It means the town is like an island, cut off from the rest of the country, but not from the weather. The year after the drought, Somalia was hit with terrible floods caused by rains made twice as intense by human-caused global warming. The floods killed hundreds and displaced 1 million people. The most vulnerable bear the brunt. The UN has developed a special classification for different degrees of hunger. It says 4 million Somalis, 1 in 5 of the population, face either acute or emergency food insecurity. It says 1.5 million children under the age of 5 are acutely malnourished. This humanitarian crisis means there's no shortage of people willing to fight. The impacts of climate change and conflict have driven around 4 million Somalis into vast makeshift refugee camps. There's little international help. Residents here pay rent and for their food and water. It is why Halima's husband and 4 of her 5 sons have taken up the only opportunities open to them as fighters in a local militia.
They are rural people with no skills, so the only work they could get was in the army. They were desperate, and when you are without food long enough and your children are looking at you, you will do anything.
Now, the people of Somalia cannot be held responsible for climate change. I've just been doing the numbers on my phone, and the entire country has emitted as much carbon dioxide since the 1950s as Americans have in, wait for it, the last 3 days. But Somalia is taking action. This power station is moving over to wind and solar power and training up a new generation of renewable energy engineers. I found entrepreneurs setting up new businesses, including this makeshift cafe in the refugee camp.
I don't subscribe to the notion that Somalia is unfixable. I think it's a fixable, and it's showing a significant progress on pretty much every front that you can look into.
So there is hope. But with climate change turbocharging the conflict in Somalia, the country will need continued international help in the effort to find peace and to build resilience against our changing climate. Justin Rolat, BBC News, Somalia.
Well, let's look a little closer with Alona Sinenko. She's regional spokesperson in the Africa International Committee of the Red Cross, and she's joining me today from Nairobi. Alona, thank you for your time. Now, more on that point about international help. This is happening, this cycle is happening in particularly vulnerable countries, isn't it?
Yes, unfortunately, this is something that we have been observing in the last decades, that the countries that are most affected by the effects of climate change are also countries that are experiencing conflict and violence, and therefore, because they don't have the institutions, the people resilience have been stretched to the limit. They are extremely vulnerable to the effects of these extreme weather events.
And Alona, that means that there's this dual impact, isn't there, on the hospitals in these countries?
On the hospitals and on absolutely everything. If we talk about the country like Somalia that has experienced 30 years of armed conflict, it has undermined the institutions across the country, and it means that people affected by the effects of climate change, they have almost no public services available to them like people in other countries would have. And this is something that we are also experiencing today with floods taking place in West Africa, where once again we see how it is the most vulnerable communities, people who have already displaced sometimes a number of times, are experiencing this weather shock, and it's very difficult for them to take on this new brunt because they just aren't prepared for that.
Well, so then what is some of the support that needs to be provided to these communities, not only from non-profits and organizations like your own, but from governments around the world?
Well, first, the organization like ours is an emergency response organization that is providing help to people affected by armed conflicts. And we are not climate specialists, and actually in the past years, we just saw that all the areas where we are working, we can no longer ignore the effect of climate change, because the same communities affected by armed conflicts, they are also experience these weather shocks. So we have been doing a lot of advocacy work, trying to advocate with the governments, with the institutions, that when the climate change conversations are taking place, when resources are allocated, people who are marginalized, who are living in the countries affected by armed conflict, sometimes in very remote areas, they must not be forgotten. They should be part of these conversations.
All right, thank you so much, Alona Sinenko.